This is Your Own Best Company, a podcast for people who love to work alone. Hey everybody, welcome to Your Own Best Company. This is a podcast for people who love working alone. My name is Franklin Taggart, and this podcast was my idea, and I am one of those people who enjoys working alone. I've always been kind of a little bit of a loner. And today's show is going to be just a little bit different from what you may be used to if you've followed the show for much of the last 10 months that it's been around. I am going to be my own guest today. Now, it's fitting, I think, on a podcast called Your Own Best Company, that the host be his own best company for at least one episode. Now, I know that some of you also keep track of the coffee breaks on the days that this podcast isn't released, and that's yet another my own. I'm my own guest there too. So anyhow, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about my story and why I feel like it's important to have a podcast that is for businesses, business owners, and creative people who want to stay at the level of being a one-person company. I get probably 3 emails a week from people who want to be a guest on the podcast, and their message is, contrary to what your podcast is about, I think that your listeners need to consider having a team or, treating themselves as the CEO of their organization. Well, folks, if that's the way that you're perceiving this podcast, you're not getting the message. And so what I wanted to talk a little bit about is my journey and why I feel it's so important to honor those of us who would like to just stay at the one-person company level and not scale beyond that. Because I feel like that there are some different values at play here that need to be expressed, they need to be clarified. But to understand them, I think it's going to be helpful for you to understand where I came from and what I'm doing here now today and how I came to create this particular podcast. So, if you'll indulge me for a little while, I'd like to tell my story. I grew up in Wyoming, with a couple of side stints in Colorado and Utah. Wyoming, for those of you who don't know, is a very rural state, and it's also somewhat isolated. It doesn't have any major cities in it. The largest cities are around 60,000 people, and most of Wyoming is a whole bunch of small towns that are just kind of spread out from one end of the state to the other. And it's a really large state. If you've never been there, you probably won't understand the concept of wide open spaces. But that is the place that I came from. And wide open spaces are my place. Those are the places where I feel at home. And those are the places where I feel comfortable. And those are the places where I feel safe. And that goes all the way back to just being, from a place where space is an operative day-to-day reality for people. And I love being from Wyoming. I have to tell you, I call Wyoming the biggest small town on earth because what's really fun about that state is that because there are so few people from there, when you're out in the world and you see somebody that has some kind of a marker from Wyoming, it's very likely that you know people in common. And one of the stories that I tell is that I worked in a music store in the D.C. area when I was living out there, and I wore my University of Wyoming sweatshirt one day into the store, and sure enough, somebody came into the store that day and he said, "Oh, you're from the University of Wyoming, or you know the University of Wyoming." And I said, "Yeah, I lived in Laramie for a couple of years when I was a kid, and my dad went there, and he got his PhD there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the guy said, oh, well, my dad teaches there too. And we struck up this conversation. And what's really interesting is we became really close friends over the next little while. And the thing that brought us together was the fact that we both had spent time growing up in Wyoming. But the thing that was really funny was that in our conversation, we were going back and forth and, finding out who he knew and who I knew. And there were literally dozens of people that we knew in common, even though we had never met. And Wyoming is just that kind of a place. It is a place not only of wide open spaces, but deep community. And those are the values that I have, that I carry with me. And it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition because, yes, I do need to have that space and solitude. That's a part of my makeup that's probably genetic, if anything else. But the other thing that's really interesting about it is that there's also that value of community and having meaningful connections with people in the midst of having that space. So those are the things about growing up in Wyoming that I recall with the most fierceness and the most fondness, is that I come from a place where space is necessary, and I come from a place where community is equally necessary. I had a tight-knit family growing up. For many years, I lived in the same town as many of my cousins and my grandparents and my great aunt, who was kind of the woman who controlled the world as far as our family was concerned. She owned a small hotel in a town called Evanston, Wyoming. And that hotel was kind of our family home base. And I really learned a lot through the hotel. The hotel was where I had my first job. When I was 6 years old, I would be the one who would go to the bank and the post office every day. I'd make the bank deposits, and I'd go to the post office and collect the mail and bring it back. She'd give me $0.25 a day, and I would usually stop off and spend my quarter at Scott's stationery store that was right there on Main Street. And Libby was the lady who worked behind the counter, and Libby, I was a familiar face, and I would go in there every day on my way home from the bank and the post office and buy a bag of penny candy, which they still had back then. And that was my first job. And Aunt Lou was my first employer until I was probably 12 or 13 years old, and we moved away. But I had jobs in the hotel. Like when I was 7 years old, I learned how to run the mangling iron to iron sheets and pillowcases. And she was kind of an old-fashioned lady, and she liked to have air-dried sheets and pillowcases. So the sheets would be run through one of those old wringer washers, and we would hang them up on the clothesline and then go take them down and mangle them. And that smell of warm linens is still one that takes me back to a place of fondness. So those were the kinds of jobs that I had early on. I was taught to work as a part of life from a very young age. I had the traditional kind of kid jobs. I had a paper route. I shoveled snow. I raked and mowed lawns, and did anything that I could to make $1. And so that was kind of ingrained into me from a very early age. When I was probably 7 or 8 years old when the Brady Bunch and the Partridge Family were on television. And those two television shows affected me on a very deep level. And in addition to those two shows, Johnny Cash had his show on at that time. Glenn Campbell had his show on at that time. And Tom Jones had his show on at that time. And they were all really music-focused shows. And I remember sneaking out of bed when I was a kid. Johnny Cash and Tom Jones came on after my bedtime. and they came on after everybody else had gone to bed too. And so I remember waking up when I was a kid and going on and turning on the TV at a really low level and getting up to the speaker and listening to Johnny Cash and Tom Jones. And I remember wanting to be a musician from that age, from the time that I was 8 and 9 years old. And I remember setting up the ottoman and the footstools in the living room at the hotel and playing drums along to the Partridge Family album for hours. And I thought being a musician would be the coolest thing ever. And that never died for me. When I got to be around 12 and 13 years old, I really wanted a guitar. My cousins had an old beat-up guitar that had 2 strings on it in their closet, and I would go over to their house and I would just sit and play that stupid old guitar for hours on end, picking out songs like Smoke on the Water and, Peter Gunn and all of those really cool, all of those really cool music things from television and records that were popular at the time. And I wanted a guitar badly. Well, I had already burned my parents on piano lessons and trumpet lessons and buying a trumpet. And I had been really excited about those instruments, and then I wasn't excited anymore, and they just kind of fell by the wayside. So my parents, having been burned twice, were a little bit slow on the uptake in buying me a guitar, but I begged. For 2 solid years, I begged for a guitar. And finally on Christmas of my 13th year, I got my first guitar, and I never looked back. That was something that I did every day. It was something that I had a lot of identity with. It was a way that I could be social with my peers and be accepted because I was doing something that was, interesting and talented, and that became my thing. So I followed my musical dreams, for a long time, and started performing for money when I was still in high school. And that was what I really wanted to do. So I went to college, and I actually didn't intend to go to college. But after I graduated from high school and all of my friends were getting ready to go off to college, I had no idea what I was going to do. I didn't have any musical gigs or anything like that going on. So about 3 weeks before school started, I went up and auditioned for a scholarship and got a scholarship at the local community college in Casper. And that was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life, because the experiences that I had in those 3 years at Casper College, which was a 2-year school, it tells you a little bit about my focus and my academic prowess. We don't want to go into my academic history. That's a tragedy. But going to Casper College, going to a community college, was one of the best things that I ever did for myself, because it put me into an arena with talented people, and it gave me opportunities that I would have probably not gotten at any other school. Like at one point, I was in 9 different performing groups at the same time, and I was going out almost every weekend on some kind of a tour of Wyoming or Colorado, or we went as far away as Portland, Oregon, on tour to recruit people for our college. And it was just a great opportunity. So those few years at Casper College were really formative for me. They told me that I could be a musician and that I had what it took to do that. I finished my college education in Indiana at a little school called Anderson. And Anderson was also a happy accident for me. I had no idea that school existed until about a week before I went there for the first time. And again, flying by the seat of my pants, I applied for a scholarship and I got it. It was one of 5 schools at the time that had a music business program in the country. And I wanted to study music business. That was the thing that was most interesting to me. And Anderson was the school that I got into. So I went to Anderson for another 3 years and finally got a bachelor's degree in music and business. My business life started at about the same time that my music career started. I was recording jingles and publishing songs and doing things like that before I even graduated from college. And I was also doing session work in different recording studios in Indiana and things like that. So I was doing all right when I was in school, but when I graduated, I found that I wasn't ready for a career. I didn't have the knowledge that it took to really put together a music career, and I was actually pretty terrified by that. So for about the next 7 or 8 years, I was involved in social services and other jobs. I had sales jobs, I had social services jobs, and at each one of those jobs, I would learn more stuff. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was that every one of those job opportunities came with training opportunities with them. So it's like I worked in a group home, and in that group home, I went through conflict resolution training, and I went through like gang intervention training, and I went through how to de-escalate, heated conversation training and things like that. And then in my sales training, I went through, I went through different kinds of communication training. So every step of the way, I was learning new skills and adding to them. And at one point, I had a friend that invited me to go to join him on a consulting weekend. He was a business consultant, and he was running a retreat for a business, and he needed help just working through the process of, what they were going through, what needed to happen next, and just to be kind of a process observer. And I found that I really loved that work. So for the next few years, I was working in corporate business consulting, and that allowed me finally to leave social services behind. I had been working in a crisis center, and by that time I was in such a crisis myself that I had no business working in a crisis center. But the training that I received over those years was really important. And having the consulting job gave me the ability to really then start to cultivate my music career. And I decided to move to Nashville. And I lived in the Nashville area for about 18 months. And I had been going down there sporadically for the previous year or so. So all told, I spent about 2 years with a little bit of change in Nashville, getting to know the people, getting to know the music scene, getting to know the publishing business and the recording business and the record industry. And I loved Nashville as a place to live, but I had a hard time balancing the consulting business with the music career. And the consulting work started to taper off. And what happened quickly after the consulting work tapered off was that I found myself in a very precarious financial position. I was basically broke. So I was selling off all of my musical equipment just to pay the rent. And I took a job installing carpet at a Motel 6. And it was the hottest work that I'd ever done. Now, I had done a lot of construction work in college, like pouring concrete and carpentry and stuff like that. But I want to tell you that installing carpet is the hottest and dirtiest and most strenuous work that I've ever done. And I was doing that for 10 hours a day, going home and getting cleaned up, and then going out and writing songs and going to songwriter nights in the evenings until like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, and then getting up at 6 a.m. the next day and doing it all over again. And so what I call my time in Nashville is my graduate school experience. That was where I really learned about how the music business works. And that was how I started to learn what I needed to do to make music the center of my own career path. At one point, a friend of mine invited me up to the Washington, D.C. area. And she was well connected to the dance and music scene in D.C. And she said, why don't you come up for the weekend and just see what's going on here? I think you're really going to like it. And I went up that weekend, and there were 2 concerts that I went to that weekend. And they were amazing music that I had not really been exposed to up until that point. And they were kind of like folk and bluegrass and old time music and Cajun music and Zydeco music. And I was just like enthralled with that. That was like such soulful stuff. And it was also surprisingly in alignment with the kind of music that I was making myself. It was the songs that I was writing had that flavor to them. And so I got offered a couple of job opportunities while I was there that weekend. And I met a couple of songwriters who were looking for lead guitar players. And the icing on the cake was the woman that I had gone to see was buying a house and needed somebody to help her remodel the basement apartment. I had just enough carpentry experience to be dangerous, but I offered to come up and help her, and she let me live there rent-free while I was helping with the basement remodel. So all of those things fell into place, and it was like a door had opened. And I had realized in my time in Nashville that the country music business wasn't exactly the best fit for me. It wasn't the kind of music that I was making, and I could write that kind of music, but it wasn't all that fulfilling. So when I moved to the DC area and started to get involved in folk music, I had really found a niche that worked for me and that was a good fit. And there were a lot of great gigs up and down the East Coast and even as far into the Midwest as like Ohio and Kentucky and places like that. So I was able to finally have a full-time career in music. One of the things that happened is while I was working at the music store, people would come in, and the way that I would sell a guitar is I would show them that they could play some simple chords. And so what I would do is I would sit down and show them how to play 3 chords that would allow them to be able to play a song by the time they left the store that day. And usually by the time they left the store that day, they were also taking home a guitar. Well, several of them would ask me if I was teaching lessons, and at that time, I had never even considered teaching lessons as an option. But the more I did it, the more I enjoyed it, and I started teaching lessons, and ultimately that became the real cornerstone of my music career, was teaching. I had an aptitude for it that I didn't know that I had, and I found that I really loved that role of teaching people how to do something that they had always wanted to do, but didn't know how to do it. And that also allowed me the flexibility to take gigs 2-3 nights a week and travel, up to 400 miles and back. If I needed to travel for a gig, I had the flexibility to be able to do that. So for the first time in my life, I was able to have a full-time music career, and I was doing great. I was having a good time. I was getting out and I was playing in fun places. I put out my first CD that happened to come out a week later than the week after 9/11. And I had had a couple of guitar students that were in the Pentagon at the time that it was attacked. So that had just happened. But in the midst of that, my CD came out and I was just walking on air. And I was getting ready to go out on tour for the CD, and the band that I was in fell apart. So I had to start from square one again. And what I had to learn how to do for myself was I had to learn how to do booking and promotion and marketing. Now, mind you, I had had businesses all the way up through this, and I finally had to start treating my own performance career as a business. And I had to really go out there and find the gigs that were right for me and build the audience that was right for my music. And it was like all of a sudden it clicked for me that the thing that was missing from my music education had been those nuts and bolts things that every entrepreneur has to learn. How to market, how to promote, how to network. All of those things were the missing ingredients from what I needed to learn in order to have a music career. So for the next 7 years, I was able to go out and have a great time of it. I won some awards. I got to play in some of the coolest venues. I got to play in the Kennedy Center, and I got to play at some of the major folk festivals like the Washington Folk Festival and some of the other big festivals on the East Coast. And I got to play with some Irish bands, and I got to play with a Cajun band, and I got to play in all these different settings, and it was so much fun. In 2006, well, let me back up a little bit. In 2003, my wife and I found out that we were pregnant, and we went through the pregnancy I didn't know that I was going to ever be a father, and I didn't actually anticipate that I was ever going to be a father. And at that point, I was 41 years old. Our daughter was born with some severe problems, and she ultimately died at the age of 10 days. And we were just heartbroken. In the midst of that, the thing that pulled me back together was the community of musicians that I was a part of, and the larger music community was so supportive. And in addition to that, we were surrounded with wonderful people in the DC area who made sure that we were taken care of. 2 years later, almost to the day, our son was born, and he came into the world a strapping young man who had big lungs and big dreams from birth, maybe even before. His name is Bodie, and he's now 16. But Bodie was born in 2005. Well, in 2006, I started to have some problems with tendonitis in both of my arms, basically from the wrist all the way up to the shoulder in both arms. And I had to stop playing. I couldn't perform. And I was really devastated by that, because music had been such a central part of my identity. And that was difficult enough. And then in 2008, I started to get very, very sick. And they thought it was my heart, because I was in congestive heart failure, and my organs were starting to fail. And they didn't know what really was going on. And then finally, in 2009, I saw a doctor just kind of at random in a community clinic. By the way, I didn't have insurance at the time. I saw a doctor at the community clinic, and he said, "Have you ever had your thyroid tested?" And I said, "I don't recall that I have." But he went through my records, and sure enough, my thyroid and all of that had never been tested. And what they found was that I have an autoimmune condition called Graves' disease. Well, I think that the tendonitis may have been an early symptom of that, because sometimes it affects the muscular system, the musculoskeletal system. And so what's really interesting to me was that I was very, very ill, and in some points during my illness, I was close to death. And I was hospitalized 6 times between 2008 and 2010. I had a lung that was surrounded by fluid, and it was compressed, and scar tissue developed around the lung so that it wouldn't expand again. So I had to go through a major surgery as well. By this time, they had discovered that the thyroid was the thing that was going on, and they were able to treat that with radiation. But it affected my energy in pretty devastating ways. So over that whole period, I was like at my wit's end. I felt like my music career was over, and I didn't know what to do. I still had mental capacity, and I could still do creative things. I could still write, and I could still spend time at the computer. So there were a couple of things that happened during that time that were really, again, very formative, somewhat accidental, and then may have just been a good coincidence for me. But one of the things that happened during that time was that it was really the first wave of digital marketing and digital business and e-commerce. And I just got really excited about things like blogging. And I had one of the first online courses that was a series of very simple guitar lessons. One of them was how to tune a guitar. I think those might still be online if you want to go looking for them. But at one point I had several blogs that I was running, 17 at once. That was the largest number that I had. But any kind of interest that I had, I would start a blog on it, and I would, make money from advertising and affiliate links and stuff like that. So I discovered that, and I discovered that I had the ability to do some very basic graphic design, like logo design and designing flyers and things like that for people. So I started to do freelance work. And in the midst of all of that, one of the interesting developments in my life was that people who I knew started to come and ask me to help them make the transition from the career that they were in into a more creative career like music or art or writing or something like that. This kind of happened just out of the blue. Now, I had one of my consulting partners back in the 90s say that I was a natural coach. And I just I didn't understand what he was talking about. And I didn't really understand what coaching was at that point. But he had said, if that's something that you ever want to do, you've got a knack for it. Well, at some point I discovered that what I was doing in helping those people, kind of figure out their direction was coaching. And the night that really came clear for me, and back it up a little bit, I've said before, one of the things that I believe very strongly is that our gifts and talents are not the same thing. That our talents are a conduit for our gifts, but our gifts are something that are more central to who we are. And what I had confused up until that point was that I had thought that music was really my purpose for living. It was really the reason that I was here. And when that was taken away, a central part of my identity was affected by that. Well, what I discovered in the meantime with all of these different opportunities that popped up when music wasn't a possibility for me was that there were other ways to express my gift. And coaching was one of them that I really enjoyed. And one of the things that happened, I remember it very clearly even to this day. I was in the hospital, and it was after I had had major surgery on my lung to remove the scar tissue and re-expand it into the cavity. And I was in intensive care, and the chaplain stopped by, who happened to be a good friend of mine. And he just wanted to see how I was doing. He knew that I had been in the hospital, and he knew that I had had that surgery that day. And he saw my name on the list. So he came in just to see how I was doing. And he came in fairly late. I think it was pretty close to midnight when he showed up. And what was really interesting was that I wasn't all that interested in talking about myself, but I asked him how he was doing in his music career. And we ended up having a nearly 3-hour conversation. And that was a part of it that was interesting to me. But the other part of it that I paid attention to was how energized I was by that conversation. Here I was after major surgery. I was on all kinds of narcotics at that point. And I was so wired after that conversation, so energized by it, that I could not sleep. And that was the night that I realized that my gift can be expressed in a number of ways. And it's not limited to any one talent. It can be expressed in any talent. And that it usually is in response to somebody else and their desire to be more creative. And that's what happened. It's like all of a sudden it clicked for me that coaching is something that I could do and that I wanted to do. So from that point on, I started to look at how can I become a coach? How can I be a professional coach? How can I be a full-time coach, etc.? Well, the good news is, from a musical standpoint, is that I regained the use of my arms and my hands, and I was able to play again starting in 2011. So in 2011, my family and I decided to move from DC area to Colorado. And I decided at that time that I wanted to split my career between music and coaching. And that worked really well for me for several years. And then finally, about, I don't know, in 2015, my dad moved in with us. He was really ill at the end of his life, and he needed permanent care, but we couldn't find a placement for him. So he came to live with us for a year before we could get him into an assisted living and then into a nursing home before he passed away. And I remember during that time realizing that I really wanted to pull back in my music and not be as active in my music career and devote more time to coaching. I was also a music director at a church, and I knew at that time that I really wanted to leave that job behind as well. So finally, in 2020, that was the year that I decided that coaching was going to be my full-time job. Now, the thing that's really interesting to me is that over the years, I've tried to have organizations and teams and work in those environments, but there were some things about that were really difficult for me. And one of them was that as long as I had other people around me and other people that I needed to make sure I was, supporting with the work, I was more in tune with their needs than I was with my own responsibilities. And so one of the things that was really difficult for me to do was to work in an organization of any kind, because I actually worked better when I was just by myself. I also realized that one of the things that I love about being my own entrepreneurial boss is the DIY aspect of it. I love learning how to do new things, and I love helping people to do those things for themselves. So that became actually kind of a central part of the coaching that I do, is I'll go out and learn how to do something to help people know how to do it when they need it, right? So if somebody needs to have a quiz for a lead magnet, I know how to do that because I went out and learned how to do it for myself. If somebody needs to have a basic website, I can help them set it up because I've done that on 3 different platforms now. And so it's like the DIY aspect has paid off for me because there are a lot of things that I know how to do, and I can help people at least make good decisions in doing those things. So I tried to work in the team paradigm for a while, and it didn't work well for me. And one of the things that I realized around the time that my dad moved in was that I also was not having a whole lot of fun marketing. I was feeling like it was that it was overwhelming, and that I couldn't do it well, and that I was spread too thin, and that I wasn't doing it very well. And as a result, I wasn't building much of a business, and I needed to. So one of the things that I really had to learn how to do for myself in that time was to leverage my greatest strengths. And that was where the whole idea of the marketing modality was born. I learned that I had to leverage my greatest strengths, and I had to honor my own preferences when it came to communication, when it came to, the kind of connections that I liked to make and the settings that I liked to make them in. So what was really interesting to me was that I found a way to be a one-person company and to be very satisfied and to be very happy with it and to generate enough revenue to be comfortable and to be able to have the life that I want. And so what I'm here to tell you is that there are going to be a lot of people with a lot of opinions. And if you want to be a one-person company that is successful on your own terms, using your greatest skills and your preferences, it can be done. And I'm here to help you with that. That's what I want to do with the rest of my working life, is to help people who want to be creative and to generate meaningful and sustainable revenue through their creativity. You are my people, and I want to help you do that. So that's my long story. And if you have stuck with me through that story, God bless you. Yeah, I can tell a long one, right? And I hope it was interesting enough to stay put. But that's where I come from. And I hope that this helps you understand why I do what I do, and, why I feel so much compassion for the people who want to do it too. So there you have it. And I will, I don't know that I have another interview scheduled for next week either. So it may be me again, but I won't talk about myself quite so much. Is that a deal? I want to just say I appreciate you listening to Your Own Best Company. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd appreciate you doing that. And if you feel like that there are people out there that would benefit from hearing my story, would you share this episode with them? That helps spread the word, and I would be honored and touched by that. I hope you have a wonderful, whatever it is where you are right now, day, evening, night. And I'll be back tomorrow with a virtual coffee break. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Your Own Best Company. If you enjoyed the show, would you do me a favor and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast host? If you really love it, leave me a review or share it with your circles. If you feel like your career is reaching a dead end, or you're feeling a deep sense of dissatisfaction in your work right now, I help people discover their gifts and then find or create new opportunities that are the best fit for their talent, experience, and lifestyle. Email me at coaching@franklintaggart.com for more information. I also help people start, finish, and launch creative projects, and I offer an ongoing marketing mastermind for solopreneurs and freelancers. More information on these programs and services can be found at franklintaggart.com. Thanks again for spending this time with me.